looking through my Planetary class, and I always wanted to ask you more about this. This is under Mercury, and you said that when the mental body gets really activated and stronger, trauma stops being, this is what I wrote down, trauma stops being trauma, it becomes a puzzle.
Yeah. Boy.
Explain what that means. And I'm trying to activate my mental body a whole lot, but I don't know what that means.
Well, part of what, I mean, Mercury is, to me, fascinating. Like, I am so fascinated by, like, all the planetary energies are really interesting, but Mercury is really something. And so the interesting thing about Mercury is that part of what Mercury does is it helps the left brain and the right brain to communicate with each other. And so what happens when the left brain and the right brain communicate with each other is that you're able to integrate things to a very high degree. And so a lot of times what happens with trauma is, it will get stuck on one side of the brain and not both sides of the brain are processing it. So even the idea of that therapy EMDR, where they move the eyes, like left to right and everything. And so that is the idea, is you're stimulating both sides of the brain so that you're able to integrate it and just like process it and let it go. And so what happens is when you work with Mercury, you're able to integrate things and kind of go through and process it to a much higher degree. And the traumas like almost shift from being like a traumatic issue, and they kind of turn into something that like, okay, this is something I have to resolve. Like, I surround myself with people who are crappy and they hurt me, so gotta start choosing better people, and who do I get rid of? Like, it starts to be like that. Like, you're almost like problem solving what happened and how to like process the pattern. Now, the ability to process all that, which we kind of have been talking about, one-on-one, is the pattern of sexual transmutation, where it's the sex chakra, then the heart, then the throat, then the crown, right? So part of that pattern, the sex chakra is tied to the generation of lower emotion. And when you generate a lot of lower emotion, and it's I don't know the word to use. I want to say weighed down in the lower centers, but it's not so much the lower centers. It impacts the basic chakra quite a bit, which would translate as to the arms and the legs. It's really harder to generate higher emotions, which would be tied to transmutation, right? And so as you kind of clean up the sex chakra, what eventually happens is that energy is easily starting to move up to the heart and actually starts to get transmuted. Then what starts to happen is then it starts to move up to the throat, and the throat starts to shift from the instinctive mind, which when you're in lower emotions, part of what happens is you have an instinctual response of how to handle the situation in the here and now, but you really don't see the consequence of any of the actions or like how you got there or like long-term strategy. It's just kind of a reactionary impulse, right? And so by going through and moving it from the sex chakra to the heart and then getting it to the throat, you're at least starting to stimulate critical thinking, and you're starting to stimulate higher creativity. And higher creativity is really those lower emotions and instinctive mind being almost like transmuted so that you are able to start interacting with the environment or the situations, problem solving, and increasing not increasing, probably a better way of saying it is like reflecting the influence of the higher soul. Like the crown is the entry point of divine energy, which we know, but the throat is like a lower reflection of the quality of the crown, right? And so when you're starting to have higher creativity there, it starts to be more of long-term problem solving. You're starting to have more abstract thinking, strategic thinking, rather than just in the here and now. And so it really starts to change the perspective, the perceptions of the mind and the brain, and it really starts to help you to see like more in depth of what's happening, and it starts to change your responses and how you handle the situation. So it in theory starts to reduce the triggers. And so like one of the things like you we were talking about is going through and cleaning those things up. But one of the next phases of that, like after you start to clean up the sex chakra, is you go through and you clean up the arms and the legs. And the arms and the legs are an extension of the basic chakra. And with lower emotions and instinctive thinking, all of that energy, instead of moving up to the heart, it actually kind of stays down in those lower centers. And the sex chakra and the basic, the energy, the kundalini energy gets like stuck, but all those lower emotions and that lower mental, like instinctive mental reactions actually start to diffuse into the arms and the legs. And so what happens is the arms and the legs are full of these kind of thought forms that they're not generated by the psyche. You know, they influence the psyche, but they're not generated by the psyche. And so as you go through and you clean all these up, it allows for the higher emotions and your mental body to become more activated. And so it changes it from an automatic behavior or a response, which means that your brain and your mind's not processing it, your body just reacts. You know, so lower emotions and instinctive responses are just responses. You know, and then later you try to make sense out of it, right? What happened? What does this mean, right? By going through and cleaning these things up, you're able to process it to a much higher degree and start to form long-term strategies where it literally like starts to turn it into like a puzzle. Like it stops being like, oh, this is good or this is bad or this is what this means or this is what that means. It just goes like, okay, I need to break out of this pattern, or I need to refine myself in this pattern. I need to grow out of this pattern. I need to evolve out of this pattern. You know, you kind of start looking at it from that point of view, and it changes that drive of trying to seek comfort, and you just go, okay, what do I got to do to be done with this? What do I got to do to make this different? What do I got to do? What do I got to let go of to make this change? And you just really start kind of problem solving it. And it's not even like you think, oh, this is good or this is bad. It's just like, this is what's got to happen.
So like, as I worry about all the people in the world with trauma that may or may not be getting professional help, I mean, can the average person just like grow, evolve, develop their mind and have, you know, like some automatic healing or shedding going on of like things like that? Or
what happens when the sex chakra isn't cleaned up enough, and the basic, which when I say the basic, I'm also meaning the arms and the legs, the tendency is to get entangled. Like, you know, we all do it to a certain degree, but people that haven't had any meditation or haven't cleaned those areas up, they get it very entangled with situations that don't allow for them to process things properly. And so sometimes they get close to it when they get older or when they get close to passing. And sometimes they just never get there. I mean, it depends on the individual.
Yeah.
Meditation, contemplation, reflection, all those are helpful, but mechanically, if those areas don't get cleaned up, potentially that's always an issue. Now, kind of based in your biology has like some mechanisms to kind of do this naturally, is like as you get older, those two centers kind of weaken over a period of time. And so that's why you'll see people who might be angry all those years, and then maybe their last 5 or 10 years, they're doing a little bit better, they're a little bit happier, they're a little bit nicer. It's because those inner centers don't quite have the energy. They're not necessarily spiritually growing and evolving, but they're just not as entangled anymore. And so, that technique where we do the instructions that were given by Moses, which is activate the heart, then the navel, then the crown. So it's basically a modified version of like Twin Hearts or the Lotus meditation in Astara. That actually has an impact, and it's stronger when you do it with the navel. Like if you don't do it with the navel, part of the thing with the navel is it's the center that's in charge of the lower centers. It regulates the lower centers in conjunction with the ajna, right? The ajna regulates all the centers. The navel regulates the navel, the spleen, the mingmen, the sex, and the basic, right? And so part of what happens there is until the lower centers are more regulated, you're generating large amounts of lower emotions all the time. So part of what happens is like when you're doing meditation, you're storing energy in the navel. Part of what you're trying to do is you're trying to regulate that center so that your upper centers can actually activate. And so when you go through and you clean up the sex, the heart, the throat, and the crown, like that pathway, and you clean up the arms and the legs, like kind of the next wave is you go and you do very specific purifications on the navel and navel minor, and it just starts to grow by leaps and bounds. All of these things contribute to the energy of Mercury. Like, they kind of go hand in hand. Anytime you look at a planetary energy, they all have different properties to them. But like you could say, if you had to boil down what they impact the most, they impact the physical form, but they impact the physical form, meaning the basic chakra, and again, meaning also the arms and legs, but they increase the state of oneness that one can experience in the form. Like oneness is expansion within the form, where like Twin Hearts, you're expanding your consciousness outside the body. In meditation on the soul or meditation on the blue pearl, you're expanding consciousness and awareness within the form, within the body, right? And so that is somewhat tied to the integration or the harnessing of planetary energies.
Okay. Thank you.
So like you're like anytime you change the basic, you're kind of changing your brain as well. And so like when you start working with the planetary energies, you are changing like the flexibility of the basic chakras, is the best way to say it. Even though like one planet is associated with this chakra, one planet is associated with that chakra. That is completely true on one level. And then on another level, you could say all the planets are associated with the basic chakra. Like all the vital centers are associated with the basic chakra. All the blood centers are associated with the basic chakra. All the alchemical processes associated with the zodiac are associated with the basic chakra. You start looking at the brain waves, that would if you boiled it down, would be more of a solar plexus thing. You know, they do a whole bunch of things, but if you boil it down, you can always take it back to the solar plexus. Where you're dealing with angels, it's access to the inner world. You're bringing in like a physicalization of divine energy into the form, or the word being made flesh. So all the angels would be associated actually with the forehead chakra. They have chakras that they have an affinity for, but when you're really doing deep work, there are certain steps that you do where it's just about doing a couple of things and then the forehead chakra. You know, so each thing has its thing. Like you look at deity yoga, that is, you could associate different deities to different chakras, but then you focus on one particular part of the energetic anatomy and the physiology to produce an even deeper result. So a lot of times what you do is you go through and you unwind the physiology so you don't cause like a healing crisis. But when you get into the deeper, more esoteric work, it's not more complicated. It's actually less complicated. It's just stronger because you've unwound everything to get there. Like if you don't unwind it, it's just like sticking a stick of dynamite in the ground. It blows everything up and it's not always stable. But if you unwind it and then go in and do that, it's very stable. It happens very quick, and it like latches on to the form.
Oh.
Like in esoteric teachings, they would say the Holy Spirit has descended and stayed, you know, where like before you would say like the I am affirmation, for example. And when you say the I am affirmation, the spiritual cord would get bigger, right? And then you say something where you identify with the body, like I'm hungry or something, the spiritual cord would shrink. When the Holy Spirit has descended and stayed, it doesn't matter which one you say, the spiritual cord actually stops shrinking.
Wow.
And if you even start to say something like where you identify with the body, it turns in from I am that I am to where it starts to flip it, where the higher soul starts to go, I am that I am. So when you start identifying with the body, the emotions, or the mind, it actually increases the soul contact because you're bringing in soul energy down.
Wow.
But that happens naturally. That's, I mean, it can be stimulated, but it's a lot of purification to do that. But sometimes people assume that that's there. Like, no need to like stimulate that. It's just a natural progression. Once the body's been cleaned up enough, it just happens naturally. It just basically means that the higher soul has physicalized into the form. You know, it's literally the word being made flesh.
Yeah. Wow.
So part of that thing that we were talking about, like going through and treating, you're unwinding some of that.
Yeah.
You know? It's best to do it in steps. Otherwise, speaking from personal experience, you can throw yourself in a little bit of a crisis. Like do it in a way that's stable. No need to be in a crisis. It's not faster. It's just more comfortable.
It's just more work and trouble. Thank you.
You're so